In the quiet village of Zamrani, nestled between vast golden fields and winding rivers, lived a young girl named Luyanda. Her father, a hard-working farmer, had passed away suddenly, leaving her in the care of his second wife, Bandel, and her son, Tunde. From the moment Luyanda's father was gone, Bandel made it clear Luyanda was nothing but an unwanted burden. Bandel had always favored her own son, Tunde, treating him like a prince, while Luyanda became nothing more than a servant in her own home. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, Luyanda was already outside sweeping the yard, fetching water, and preparing meals. She was the first to wake and the last to sleep, yet no matter how hard she worked, nothing she did was ever good enough for Bandel. If the food was too salty, she was scolded. If the floor had even a speck of dust, she was punished. Tunde, who once played with Luyanda as a child, had turned against her under his mother's influence. He began to see her not as his stepsister, but as a worthless nobody. He never lifted a finger to help, and instead took pleasure in making her life miserable. Whenever Luyanda walked past him, he would stick out his foot to trip her. When she carried a heavy pot of water, he would push it just to watch her struggle. But the worst of all was his daily ritual, spitting on her. Every single day, without fail, Tunde would spit at Luyanda. Whether she was sweeping the front yard, washing the dishes, or simply walking by, he would sneer and spit, laughing as he did it. "You're nothing, just dirt under my feet," he would say. The villagers saw what was happening, but no one interfered. Some pitied her, some whispered behind her back, but no one dared to challenge Bandel or stop Tunde. Luyanda never fought back. She simply wiped her face, swallowed her pain, and continued working. Deep inside, she longed for the warmth of a family, for someone to stand up for her, but she knew that in this house, kindness was something she would never receive. She often wondered if her father was watching from the heavens, if he could see how much she suffered. But despite everything, Luyanda did not let their cruelty break her spirit. She refused to let their hatred define her. Every day, as she scrubbed the floors and mended torn clothes, she dreamed of a life beyond these walls, a life where she would be respected, where she would be free. What she didn't know was that fate had already begun to weave a different path for her, one that would change her life forever. Luyanda's life was a constant battle against hunger, cold, and cruelty. While Tunde feasted on the finest meals their father had left behind, she was given nothing but scraps, if she was given anything at all. Often, she went to bed with an empty stomach, listening to the sound of Tunde laughing as he ate bowls of rich soup and tender meat. The smell would fill the house, taunting her, reminding her that she was unwanted. If she dared to ask for more food, Bandel would snap at her. "You should be grateful you even have a roof over your head," she would say, her sharp eyes filled with contempt. Her clothing was no better. While Tunde wore new tunics and sandals, Luyanda's clothes were torn, faded, and barely covered her properly. The cold nights were the worst. She would curl up in a corner of the house, shivering, wrapping herself in a thin cloth that did little to keep her warm. But no matter how much she suffered, no one in the village stepped forward to help. People saw what was happening. They saw how Luyanda carried heavy water pots while Tunde sat idly by. They saw how she worked from dawn till nightfall, scrubbing floors, washing clothes, and cooking meals she wasn't even allowed to eat. They saw how Bandel's insults cut her down like a blade, and how Tunde spat at her feet as if she were nothing. Yet, no one spoke up. Some pitied her, shaking their heads as they passed by, whispering about how sad her fate was. Others simply accepted it, believing that life had simply been unfair to her. After all, she had no father to protect her, no family to defend her. She was just an unfortunate child, born into misfortune. Despite everything, Luyanda never let hatred fill her heart. She did not fight back, nor did she curse her fate. Instead, she worked harder. She carried herself with quiet dignity, never complaining, never lashing out, even when her body ached from exhaustion. There were moments when she wanted to cry, to scream, to ask the heavens why she had to suffer so much, but she held back her tears, refusing to give Bandel and Tunde the satisfaction of seeing her break. At night, when the house was quiet, she would stare at the stars, whispering her dreams to the sky. She dreamed of a different life, a life where she was free, where she was loved, where she was respected. She did not know how or when, but deep inside, she believed that one day things would change, that one day she would no longer be the girl people pitied, but the woman they admired. What Luyanda didn't know was that fate had already begun to move in her favor. The world had a way of rewarding those with pure hearts. And soon, the girl who had nothing would have everything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, Luyanda made her way to the village stream. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence around her. With an old clay pot balanced on her hip, she walked barefoot along the narrow path, her thin frame moving carefully over the uneven ground. This was her only moment of peace, away from Bandel's scolding and Tunde's cruel laughter. As she neared the stream, she noticed a figure sitting on a large rock beneath a tall baobab tree. It was an old woman, her body frail, her clothes dusty and worn. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her stomach, and her tired eyes barely lifted when Luyanda approached. Luyanda hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. "Ma, are you all right?" she asked softly. The old woman let out a weary sigh. "I am just tired, child, and hungry. It has been a long journey, and my legs do not carry me as they once did." Luyanda glanced down at the small bundle she carried. Inside was the only piece of dry bread she had managed to save from the kitchen that morning. It wasn't much, but she knew hunger well. She knew the pain of an empty stomach, the weakness that came when one had nothing to eat. Without a second thought, she unwrapped the bread and placed it in the woman's hands. "Here," she said gently. "It's not much, but please eat." The old woman looked up, surprise flickering in her tired eyes. She studied Luyanda's face for a long moment before breaking the bread into small pieces and eating slowly. When she finished, she straightened her back, as if strength had returned to her limbs. "You have given me your only food," the woman said, her voice now steadier. "Why?" Luyanda shrugged. "Because you needed it more than I did." A smile spread across the woman's lips. "The world does not often show kindness to those who have little, yet you have given without hesitation." She reached for Luyanda's hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Your heart will take you where others' strength cannot." Luyanda blinked, confused by the woman's words. Before she could ask what she meant, the old woman stood up with a grace that seemed impossible for someone so frail. She gave Luyanda one last knowing look before disappearing into the trees, leaving behind only the scent of wild herbs in the air. Luyanda stood still, her heart pounding. Something about that woman was different, almost otherworldly. She had no idea that this small act of kindness had just set something greater in motion. Her life, which had been filled with hardship and humiliation, was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The morning after her encounter with the mysterious old woman, Luyanda was bent over, scrubbing the wooden floor of Bandel's house when she heard voices outside. Curious, she straightened up, wiping sweat from her forehead, and peeked through the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. Standing in the middle of their dusty compound was the same old woman from the night before, Ezeji, but she was no longer hunched over and weak. She stood tall, her presence commanding, her eyes sharp. Beside her was a man dressed in regal attire. It was Chief Obafemi, the most powerful man in Zamrani. Bandel rushed outside, her face full of forced smiles, while Tunde stood behind her, shifting uncomfortably. "My chief, what an honor," Bandel said, bowing deeply. "To what do we owe this visit?" Ezeji did not waste time with pleasantries. She pointed at Luyanda. "This girl," she said firmly, "I have seen her heart. She is not meant for this life of suffering. The palace has need of a diligent worker, and I have chosen her." The words sent a wave of shock through the household. Bandel's eyes widened in disbelief, and Tunde scoffed, shaking his head. "Luyanda?" he sneered. "She is nothing but a worthless girl. What use could she possibly be in the palace?" Chief Obafemi's deep voice cut through the air. "The queen trusts Ezeji's wisdom. If she says this girl is worthy, then she is worthy." He turned to Luyanda. "Child, do you wish to serve in the palace?" Luyanda's heart pounded. This was her chance, her escape from the pain, the humiliation, the hunger. She looked at Bandali and Tunde, who stared at her with silent rage, knowing they could not defy the chief's command. She turned back to Ezeji, whose eyes held something she could not explain. "Hope. Yes," she whispered, then louder, with more confidence. "Yes, I will go." Without another word, Ezeji and Chief Obafemi led her away. Luyanda did not look back. For the first time in her life, she was walking towards something, toward a future of her own choosing. The palace was unlike anything she had ever seen. Grand pillars stretched toward the sky, and golden ornaments gleamed under the sunlight. Servants moved gracefully through the vast halls, each one dressed in fine robes, their faces calm and dignified. Luyanda, dressed in her ragged clothes, felt out of place, but she reminded herself this was her new home now. She worked harder than anyone, waking before sunrise and retiring long after the stars filled the sky. She cleaned, cooked, and ran errands with such dedication that whispers of her work ethic spread through the palace. One day, Queen Nkemdilim herself noticed the quiet girl who never complained, never rested until her work was done. This girl, the queen said, watching Luyanda serve guests with the grace of someone far beyond her station, she is different. And so, in an unexpected turn of fate, Luyanda was given something she had never dreamed of, the opportunity to learn. She was to be educated alongside the royal children, to sit where only the privileged sat, to rise beyond the life she had known. Her journey of transformation had begun. Luyanda had never held a book in her hands before arriving at the palace. The first time she touched the smooth pages, she felt as though she had entered a different world, one where knowledge was power, and power could change destinies. She struggled in the beginning, her fingers fumbling over the unfamiliar symbols of letters and numbers, but she refused to give up. Every night, long after the palace had fallen into silence, she sat by the dim light of an oil lamp, tracing the words with her fingers, whispering them to herself until they became familiar. The other students, children of noble families, scoffed at her at first. They mocked her accent, laughed at her mistakes, and whispered behind her back. But Luyanda had endured worse before. Their words could not break her. Instead, she pushed herself harder. She listened. She practiced. She learned. Day by day, she improved. Within a year, she was not just keeping up with the noble children, she was surpassing them. Among those who noticed her brilliance was the crown prince, Akane. At first, he observed her from afar, curious about the girl who had come from nothing but carried herself with quiet strength. Unlike the others, he never mocked her. Instead, he challenged her, asking difficult questions, testing her knowledge, pushing her to think beyond the lessons in the books. "You see things differently," he told her one afternoon as they sat beneath the great palace tree, discussing politics and trade. "You think like a leader." Luyanda shook her head, laughing softly. "I am only a girl who was given a chance." Akene studied her for a moment before saying, "Sometimes, a single chance is all destiny needs." The years passed, and Luyanda grew into a woman of wisdom and grace. The queen, who had once merely taken pity on a hard-working girl, began to truly see her. Luyanda was not just smart, she was strategic. She understood people, she could read a room, she could predict the outcome of decisions before they were even made. One evening, as Queen Nkemdilim sat with her council, she found herself watching the advisors argue over trade agreements, none of them offering a clear solution. Without thinking, she turned to Luyanda, who stood quietly at the back of the hall. "What do you think?" the queen asked. The room fell silent. The noblemen and scholars turned to stare at the girl who had once been a mere palace maid. Luyanda did not flinch. She stepped forward, her voice calm and measured, and laid out a plan, one that was so precise, so insightful, that even the oldest advisors were left speechless. From that day forward, the queen no longer saw Luyanda as just a student or a servant. She saw her as something far greater. She saw her as a woman who had risen from the ashes of suffering and transformed into a force of wisdom and strength. And so, when the time came to appoint a new royal advisor, there was no question. The girl who had once scrubbed palace floors now stood beside the queen, her head held high, her past nothing more than a distant shadow behind her. While Luyanda's life blossomed into something extraordinary, Tunde's world was falling apart in a way no one could have imagined. As the years went by, he grew more and more arrogant, consumed by his own sense of entitlement. He had never known real struggle, and the wealth his mother, Bandel, once controlled, only fueled his recklessness. Instead of using his position to better himself, he squandered it on gambling, lavish parties, and pointless luxuries. He wasted money on expensive clothes, drank away his future, and surrounded himself with people who enabled his bad habits. Bandel, who had once looked down on Luyanda, found herself growing desperate. She tried to keep up the facade of prosperity, but it was all slipping away. Tunde's bad choices were dragging them deeper into debt, and no matter how much she begged him to change, he refused. "I have everything I need," he would say, his eyes bloodshot from nights of gambling. "Why work when the world can be mine for the taking?" But the world, as it often does, had a way of humbling the proud. The first blow came when famine swept across the village. Crops withered, animals died, and the markets emptied. Suddenly, the money that had once flowed like a river in Bandel's house began to dry up. Tunde, who had spent his days partying, found that his wealth wasn't eternal. The lavish meals, the fine clothes, the endless nights of pleasure, all of it vanished. Soon, the once proud household that had been a symbol of power and wealth became a shadow of its former self. Bandel's pleas for help fell on deaf ears, and the people who had once bowed to her turned their backs. Without wealth or influence, the family had nothing. And yet, Tunde refused to change. He was too proud to beg, too stubborn to admit that his reckless behavior had destroyed everything. As the famine deepened, the villagers who once feared them now looked down on them. Tunde and his mother were no longer the rulers of the streets. They were beggars. The same streets where they had once walked in fine clothes, looking down on the others, now seemed like an endless stretch of shame. They begged for scraps of food, their pride completely shattered. The very people they had once ignored or ridiculed now passed by without a second glance. Tunde, with his arrogance still burning in his chest, couldn't bring himself to face reality. He refused to kneel and ask for help, still clinging to the delusion that life owed him something. Meanwhile, Bandel, broken by the loss of everything she once held dear, finally saw the true price of their selfishness. She watched helplessly as Tunde continued down his path of self-destruction. Unable to stop the inevitable, the fall from grace was complete. The son who had spit on Luyanda, the daughter who had once been a servant in their house, now had the last laugh. Tunde and Bandel, once on top, now had nothing but each other, and neither of them was strong enough to rebuild the life they had destroyed. The day of the grand festival finally arrived, and the village of Zamrani buzzed with excitement. The streets were adorned with vibrant decorations, and the air was filled with the sound of drums and cheerful voices. The festival, which was held once every few years, was a celebration of the village's prosperity. But this year, it had a deeper meaning. For the first time in decades, the village had a true reason to celebrate, a reason that came with honor, respect, and a story that would be told for generations to come. Luyanda, now a royal advisor and a respected figure across the land, was invited to be the guest of honor. The news of her success had spread far and wide, reaching the ears of kings and chiefs, and everyone wanted to witness the return of the girl who had once been humiliated and forgotten. As she walked through the palace gates, her long flowing robes shimmered in the sunlight. The robes, crafted from the finest silks and adorned with gold, were a far cry from the ragged clothes she had once worn. Her beauty had only deepened with time, but it was her grace and confidence that truly captured the attention of everyone who saw her. As Luyanda entered Zamrani, the villagers lined the streets to welcome her. They cheered, clapping their hands in unison as she passed by. The same people who had once turned a blind eye to her suffering now admired her strength and determination. Her name, once whispered in the shadows, was now spoken with reverence. Luyanda had become a living legend, a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of kindness. But among the crowd, there was one person who couldn't bear to look at her. Tunde, the arrogant, spoiled son who had once spit on her every day, now stood in the shadows, hidden from the eyes of the village. His clothes were ragged, and his face, once full of pride, was now etched with defeat. His mother, Bandel, stood beside him, but neither of them could hide the shame that hung over them like a dark cloud. Tunde watched in disbelief as Luyanda, the sister he had tormented for years, was treated like royalty. Chiefs, noblemen, and even the elders of the village bowed their heads in respect as she passed. She was the one they all wanted to honor, and Tunde could hardly recognize the girl who had once been beneath him. His stomach turned with envy as he saw the wealth and respect she had earned, while he had nothing but the tattered remnants of his former life. He couldn't fathom how this could be happening. How had the girl he had belittled become the pride of the entire village, while he, his own flesh and blood, was reduced to nothing? Luyanda's rise was a sharp reminder of the price of arrogance and cruelty, a reminder that life had a way of humbling those who believed they were invincible. As the festival continued, Tunde couldn't bring himself to face her. He knew that no matter how much time passed, he would never be able to undo the hurt he had caused. The gap between them had grown too wide, and Luyanda, now standing tall among the people who had once looked down on her, would never look back. She had risen above the ashes, and nothing could take away her crown. As the festival continued, Tunde stood in the shadows, his eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet Luyanda's gaze. The once proud young man, who had made her life a living hell, now felt small and insignificant. His heart ached with shame as he watched his sister, the very person he had spit on every day, being honored by the entire village. She was now a symbol of grace and power, while he had become a mere beggar, invisible to the world. Luyanda, however, was not blind to the pain in Tunde's eyes. Despite everything he had done to her, despite the humiliation and suffering he had caused, she saw the brokenness in him. She had spent years learning the importance of kindness and humility, and in that moment, she decided to teach Tunde a lesson that would stay with him forever, not through vengeance, but through compassion. Instead of walking past him, ignoring his existence as he had done to her, Luyanda approached her brother. The crowd hushed as she made her way towards Tunde, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Tunde could hardly bear to look up, afraid of the contempt he might see in her eyes. But Luyanda was different. She didn't let anger cloud her judgment. Instead, she extended her hand, offering him something she had never been given: mercy. "I know you're hungry," Luyanda said softly, her voice calm and gentle. "Come with me. I'll give you food and a place in the royal kitchen to work." Tunde looked at her in disbelief. The sister he had humiliated for years was now offering him kindness. He couldn't understand it. Why wasn't she angry? Why wasn't she throwing him out like he deserved? But Luyanda's words were sincere, and her eyes held no malice, only a quiet understanding that made him feel even more ashamed. Bandel, who had been watching from the sidelines, could hardly believe what she was witnessing. Her son, once so powerful and proud, was now being offered a place in the royal kitchen, like a servant. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. This was the consequence of her cruelty, her constant favoritism toward Tunde, and her mistreatment of Luyanda. She had allowed her son to become arrogant and entitled, and now, in a cruel twist of fate, he was the one suffering. She had treated Luyanda like a burden, and now her own flesh and blood was the one who had been humbled. As Luyanda gently guided Tunde toward the palace kitchen, the villagers watched in awe. What had once seemed like a story of revenge was now becoming a tale of forgiveness and redemption. Tunde, still unsure of what to do, followed her. His heart was heavy, but there was something inside him, a spark of realization. Perhaps he wasn't as invincible as he thought. Perhaps it was time to learn what true strength really was. For the first time in his life, Tunde felt the weight of his actions, and though he was ashamed, there was a part of him that felt grateful. Luyanda had shown him a path he had never considered, one of humility, service, and the possibility of redemption. The journey to truly understanding the meaning of life had just begun for him. As time passed, the village of Zamrani began to see the profound changes that had taken place. The story of Luyanda's transformation from a mistreated, unwanted child to a respected leader became the heart of the village's legacy. It wasn't just the royal robe she wore or the power she held that earned her admiration. It was the way she had forgiven the very people who had wronged her, showing a strength of character that inspired everyone around her. The villagers, once indifferent to her suffering, now found themselves reflecting on the lesson Luyanda had taught them. Kindness, respect, and humility weren't just words. They were values that could change lives. Luyanda's story was a living testament to the fact that no matter how difficult life seemed, there was always a path to greatness if one chose to walk it with integrity. Her rise wasn't about revenge or bitterness. It was about perseverance, empathy, and the willingness to extend a hand even when others had turned away. Tunde, on the other hand, had become a different man. The arrogance and pride that had once defined him had crumbled away, replaced by a deep sense of humility. He worked tirelessly in the royal kitchen, learning the value of hard work and responsibility. Every day, he put his hands to labor, knowing that he was trying to rebuild what he had lost. The pain of his past mistakes still lingered, but with each passing day, he slowly regained the respect of those around him. He had learned the hard way that wealth and power meant nothing if they were built on cruelty, and that true strength came from within, from the heart. But the real change in Tunde wasn't just in his actions, it was in his heart. He began to look at Luyanda with admiration instead of resentment. He understood now the depth of her kindness and how her humility had been her greatest strength all along. No longer did he see her as the sister he had tormented. He saw her as the woman who had shown him the way back from the depths of his own failure. As Luyanda's story spread, it reached beyond the borders of Zamrani, inspiring many far and wide. Young girls, especially, found courage in her journey. They saw in Luyanda a reflection of their own struggle and realized that no matter their circumstances, they too could rise above adversity. Her story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that no matter how dark the path seemed, kindness, hard work, and belief in oneself could lead to the light. In the years that followed, Luyanda continued to serve as a trusted advisor to the royal family, but it was her role as a mentor to others that truly defined her legacy. She taught the children of the village the lessons she had learned, the importance of empathy, the value of education, and the strength of character. She became a symbol of what was possible when one refused to let life's hardships define them. And so, the village of Zamrani thrived, a place where kindness was treasured, respect was earned, and the stories of fate were written not in the stars, but in the hearts of those who chose to believe in themselves, no matter where they started. Years had passed, and Luyanda's name was known far and wide. Her journey, from the depths of despair to becoming the heart of the village, had become a living legend. The village of Zamrani, once a place where she was overlooked and mistreated, now stood as a symbol of her strength. The people knew her as more than just a leader. She was a beacon of hope, a woman who had risen above the cruelty of the past and built a future not with revenge, but with kindness. One fateful day, the village elders gathered to honor Luyanda in a grand ceremony. The air was thick with excitement as people from neighboring villages came to witness the moment. The chief, Obafemi, stood at the front of the crowd, a proud smile on his face, as he called Luyanda to the stage. In his hands, he held a golden plaque engraved with her new title, The Light of Zamrani. The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time, Luyanda could see the faces of those who had once turned away from her. Now full of admiration, she had truly become the heart and soul of the village. The title was not just for her achievements, but for the light she had brought into the lives of everyone around her. As the cheers of the crowd rang in her ears, Luyanda looked out over the sea of faces, her heart full of gratitude. She had never sought this kind of recognition, but it felt like the culmination of everything she had worked for. The long nights of toil, the suffering, and the moments of doubt had all led to this. And yet, her greatest victory was not the title she held, but the person she had become. A person who had learned to forgive, to love, and to believe in herself. In the midst of the celebration, Tunda stepped forward, his face etched with regret. He had changed, and the man who once spat on his sister now stood before her, humbled. The crowd fell silent as he spoke. Luyanda, I cannot undo the pain I caused you. I was wrong, and I see that now. I have spent years regretting my actions, and today, I stand before you not as your tormentor, but as your brother, asking for your forgiveness. Luyanda looked at him, her heart heavy with the memories of the past. She had suffered, but she had also learned that holding on to hate only kept her bound to the past. Slowly, she stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. Tunde, she said softly, her voice steady. You are my brother. The past cannot be changed, but today is a new day. Let us start fresh. The crowd watched in awe, witnessing the powerful moment of reconciliation. Tunde had learned a hard lesson, that actions have consequences, but it was never too late to change. And in that moment, both siblings understood that forgiveness was not about forgetting, but about moving forward with an open heart. Luyanda's story had become a tale of ultimate triumph, not because she had defeated her enemies, but because she had triumphed over herself. Her kindness, her perseverance, and her unwavering belief in a better future had turned her into a living legend. Her journey proved that fate doesn't reward those who seek revenge, but those who carry pure hearts and rise above the ashes of their struggles. And as the title of The Light of Zamrani echoed through the village, it was clear that Luyanda's name would be remembered for generations to come, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of hope, redemption, and the power of a kind heart. If you've been moved by Luyanda's incredible journey of resilience, forgiveness, and triumph, then you're not alone. Her story reminds us all that no matter how tough life gets, there's always hope, and our hearts can guide us to unimaginable heights. Luyanda's strength, kindness, and unwavering belief in a better future are lessons we can carry with us every single day. Her victory wasn't just in her title, it was in her ability to forgive, to rise above the past, and to help others see the light in themselves. If this story touched you, make sure to share it with others so they too can witness the power of kindness and redemption. Luyanda's story is one that needs to be heard, and by sharing it, you help spread her message of hope and strength. Don't forget to like this video if it inspired you, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales of courage and transformation. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for being a part of our journey, and remember, no matter what you're facing, you have the power to rise above and shine bright, just like Luyanda.
Sangi हाल वे ठीक है करूँ वडेरे दडे हाल तगड़ी है घर वाले बहनी बेरा सारे ठीक है तू ही कहता कर सांगे वीडियो अपने एडवांस शेड्यूल की थी है चलो एक रात घर गुजारी है कौन ही मसला
मेरे को नहीं इतना फील ना वीडियो वाले और नहीं आ रहे
दो वीडियो एक चैनल है ना 4 वीडियो तक बनाने में पोस्ट नहीं करें तू ना बना सकता एक रात से मैं तो वैसे तेरे पर वादा पे हम भी वैसे ये बंदा तू बात तू बजाना पे हमना सफर देख सारा बाकी साकू के राज सारी जानते के राज सर वैसे होते चलो भाई कार शहर बना रहे अंदर सारा तक भी ऐसा है ना घर वाले बस यही सारा घर है तो पीछे घर है कोई वतन वेव शो की वीडियो वायरल थी है वीडियो भी भाई वायरल थी है अल्लाह खैर करे से तो सबर आज नहीं आया हमने हासिल ये हमारा ऑफिस है मेरी वीडियो बन रही है क्योंकि मैंने स्टोरी वाली वीडियो पे लगाना है अपने मोबाइल से वीडियो बना रहा हूँ क्योंकि मैंने वीडियो के एंड पे अपनी वीडियो लगानी है और मैं ये सब कह रहा हूँ उनसे शाहजहान इधर आ जाओ आपको वीडियो में आ जाओ आप भी इधर आ जाओ इनसे कहो कि मेरे भाई को आप वायरल करें उनकी वीडियो को वायरल करें मैं हूँ ना आपका भाई
अस्सलाम वालेकुम गाइस अस्सलाम वालेकुम गाइस आप मेरे भाई को वायरल कर देना और उसके सारे पैसे मुझे देना क्योंकि वो कहता है कि मुझे पैसे चाहिए है ना बोलो
अब आज जवाब तो हो गया आप शाहजहान को बोलने दो उनको समझ नहीं आती ये अफ्रीकन लोग देखते हैं ना वो तो अंग्रेज हैं इंग्लिश में नहीं बोलते
हम मुसलमान हैं
हम मुसलमान हैं वो अंग्रेज हैं पागल इंग्लिश में नहीं बोलना बस आप आ जाओ आपने जो बोलना हाय फ्रेंड्स की बच्ची ये देखो हट जाओ खूबसूरत आगे से हट जाओ वे यार ही ना है ये वीडियो शाहजहान की बन रही है हाँ आपको अंग्रेज लोग देखेंगे आप बीच में ना आओ वीडियो में ये अच्छी बात नहीं होती ऐसा ना शाहजहान
ये अंग्रेज हो गया तुम जो समझेगी अंग्रेज क्यों पर काम
हट जा
अगली बार गुड खेलूंगा तुम्हारी गुड
ओए ना करो फिर देख
हाय गाइस मैं हूँ अंग्रेज अबीरा
अंग्रेज ये हमारी वीडियो बन रही है। ये मेरा शाहजहान छोटा भाई बैठा है मेरे साथ।
और ये मैं छोटी मैं हूँ। मैं मियाँ हूँ मियाँ। अरे गाइस मैं मियाँ हूँ।
ये हमारी
गाइस मैं मियाँ, ये मेरा